As the Israeli airstrikes in the occupied Gaza Strip continue, it's not just the death toll that's been rising. So far, around 58,000 of Gaza's 2 million residents have been displaced, as more than 400 buildings, from homes to hospitals to schools, have been damaged or destroyed. But who are the 1.9 million Gazans? For one thing, they're quite young. According to the UN, more than 50% of Gaza residents are under 18 years old, which is why so many children, similar to Nadine, have been killed or injured or left homeless. More than half of Gazans are food insecure, and more than 75% are recipients of some kind of aid. Perhaps the most stark reminder of what this decades-old conflict has meant is that 1.4 million of Gaza's nearly 2 million residents, the vast, vast majority, are refugees. And it's why the UN's United Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, or UNRWA, is so important. The UN created UNRWA in 1949 to provide support to Palestinians displaced by the creation of Israel. It's still the UN's only agency dedicated to helping refugees from just one specific region or conflict. Earlier this week, Matthias Schmale, the director of UNRWA, condemned Israel's bombing of a Gaza refugee camp, calling it terror from the skies on a civilian population. So how has the aid group been managing its critical work during this recent escalation? And what is life like right now for the refugees in Gaza that it serves? Earlier today, I spoke with UNRWA's Director of Operations in Gaza, Matthias Schmale, who's been living there since 2017. Matthias, you're in Gaza right now. You've thankfully survived the Israeli airstrikes of the past week. For those of us outside of Gaza, outside the region, tell us what it's been like for you, for your colleagues on the ground there over the past 10 days.
Well, we have just finished day 9 of this, and I call it a war. For me, this is war. We are dealing with a terrified population. And when I say war, a part of that is that the price the civilian population is paying is unacceptable and unbearable. So let me illustrate that a little bit. There are, of course, people killed. And among the more than 60 children, there are 18 children that went to our UNRWA schools, or 19 by now, unfortunately. Behind those numbers are, of course, individual stories that are tragic. And let me tell you two, if I may. One is a 13-year-old boy whose name escapes at the moment. He was on his way home from shopping in the market. His mother is severely disabled. His father died a few years ago. So this kid was taking care of his family, basically, doing the family groceries. And he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time on his way back. So he went out shopping and never returned. The house that was demolished in Beach Camp that went through the news a couple of days ago, 10 people killed, and 6 of them children, 5 of them, again, in an UNRWA school. I'm also telling you this because one of the arguments I hear a lot is that Hamas is hiding behind the civilian population. I would venture that these two cases at least show that that's nonsense, that very often innocent civilians are struck by vicious retaliatory strikes.
Yes. Yes, indeed. And I want to come back to Hamas in a moment, but let me just ask you this. On Monday, you wrote on Twitter that UNRWA had been denied movement of people and goods for over a week. Israel, of course, says Gaza is no longer occupied. So who exactly was denying you that movement? And have you been able to get aid in since you tweeted?
Okay, so it was Israel denying us that movement. Nothing enters Gaza, at least for us, because we come through Israel, and the main terminal for getting goods in is Kerem Shalom. Nothing gets in there without Israeli approval. And for 8 days or 7 days in a row, nothing came in. After I tweeted, and I don't think it's linked to my tweet, we finally then got in 5 fuel trucks, and we were also on the way of bringing in food, and there's like a no man's zone where the food gets offloaded, and then trucks from here pick it up. Now, there's still food stuck there because it was offloaded, I think 2 trucks, and then the Israelis closed the terminal at Kerem Shalom because of security reasons, shelling from this side.
So when it comes to the humanitarian situation, at least last month, President Biden resumed the U.S.'s funding, $235 million in aid funding for Palestinians, funding which Donald Trump stopped in 2018. $150 million of that aid is for UNRWA in particular, which, to be clear for our viewers, is less than half of what the UNRWA aid used to be at the end of Obama's term in office. What does that aid now fund in Gaza right now, and is it enough?
Well, it's not enough, but it's welcome, of course. We cannot, we need everything we can get. So what the 150 million funds at the moment is our core services. And that means, for example, 22 primary healthcare centers, which are not at the front line of treating war wounded, but they provide essential services, for example, to non-communicable disease patients, that like diabetes patients who still need medicine, to pregnant women, especially those with difficulties. We continue child vaccination. So there is a basic primary health care that is funded with this $150 million. We also continue to do education. Amazingly, my chief of education, who is responsible for running 278 schools for 85,000 children, said a few days ago, we must resume online and remote learning because despite the war, children we can reach need to be occupied with something more meaningful than constantly listening to bombs falling.
Indeed, the bombs falling is just tragic. Israel, of course, blames those bombs falling on Hamas. They say it's all the fault of Hamas and Hamas rockets. They blame the situation in Gaza on both Hamas rockets into Israel and Hamas misrule in the Gaza Strip. They also point out that the Ministry of Health, which puts out civilian casualty data there, is run by Hamas, and that the Israelis say it can't be trusted. They point out that Hamas doesn't allow for free speech in the Strip either. What's been your experience of dealing with Hamas, dealing with their health ministry? Because your critics in Israel say UNRWA is too close to Hamas.
I have been here 3.5 years or a bit more longer, and I think I have a pretty good sense of who Hamas is and what they've done. There is no doubt in my mind that they have not ruled this place well. There's also no doubt in my mind that it is wrong to fire rockets into Israel. Having said that, I have to tell you that I've been surprised over these last 9 days about a number of my Palestinian colleagues who I got to know as very moderate, reasonable people, not at all fans of Hamas. They hate Hamas and what they've done to the Gaza Strip, who have said at least Hamas is doing something instead of talking in reaction to what happened in Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem and in Sheikh Jarrah, where families who've lived there for generations are threatened with eviction. So, ordinary Palestinians, moderate Palestinians at the moment are feeling, they are feeling ambivalent, but they see the origin of what is currently going on in the wider Palestinian context rather than Hamas starting this. They see Hamas reacting. I want to underline again, that doesn't mean that I justify what Hamas is doing, but I think we all need to carefully understand that there is at the moment quite a Palestinian momentum between the West Bank, between here and Palestinians living in Israel.
Well, I appreciate the insights. And Matthias Schmale, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. Thank you for doing what you do, and please do stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Israel says around 4,000 rockets have been launched out of Gaza, 90% of which were intercepted. That's thanks to Israel's US-funded security system, the Iron Dome, that provides Israel protection from projectiles not only from Palestinian territories, but Syria and Lebanon as well. In fact, the IDF say they intercepted one rocket of 4 fired from Lebanon today. Still, some 250 Hamas rockets from Gaza, according to Axios, have landed inside of Israel and have led to both deaths and injuries, with Israelis having spent the past 10 days hearing air raid sirens blaring and heading down into fortified bunkers to try and stay safe. And the current threat from the skies has also spilled into violence on the streets, with Israeli Jews and Palestinians alike becoming victim to mob attacks and violence. Drivers attacked, restaurants burned down. One Israeli has been killed as part of that street-level violence. So how are Israelis reacting to the conflict both in Gaza and at home? And what role has Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu played in fanning the flames both in Gaza and at home? Earlier I spoke to the well-known Israeli journalist Barak Ravid, a contributing columnist at Axios based in Tel Aviv. Barak Ravid joins me now from Tel Aviv. Barak, I want to talk about some of your reporting and analysis in a moment, but let's just talk about you first. You have been living under 10 days of rocket fire, 10 days of sirens, 10 days of war. What has that experience been like for you, for your family, for your neighbors?
Well, you know, it's not a nice situation, to say the least. And, you know, like me, there are many Israelis that in the current conflict were really part of it, because, you know, we've been going through those things both in Israel and in Gaza for 15 years now. We had 4 wars, several flare-ups, rounds of violence, whatever you want to call it. And in most of those rounds of violence, the center of Israel was mostly out of the picture. Or, you know, if there were rockets fired, it was like 1 or 2. This time around, it's 250 rockets on Tel Aviv in the center of Israel. And I think that more than everything, many Israelis who live in the center, in Tel Aviv, in other cities in the area, finally understand what it means to live in southern Israel, where they have rockets almost every day for the last 15 years.
Barak, I want you to take a listen to an Israeli restaurant owner who talks about not letting the destruction of his restaurant boil into hatred. Have a listen.
I try to ignore and not to reach a point of feeling hatred, because it doesn't lead to anything that is positive. I have no intention to take revenge.
Barak, it's a commendable attitude, but how rare is it right now in your country? How many Israelis are aware of what's going on in Gaza, for example, on the ground with their civilian counterparts there?
Well, I think it's, you know, we just saw Uri Yeremias from the city of Accra, and his restaurant was burned during the riots, was burned by his Arab neighbors. And I think that even though we've seen in the last 2 weeks a lot of hatred on both sides, okay, there's more than enough for everybody, I think there are quite a lot of people in Israel who feel that not everybody hates us. It's not that everybody wants to annihilate us. There are people that we can talk to. There are people that we have to talk to. And there are people that are suffering in Gaza. Again, I admit, you know, emotions are running high in this country. I get those ricochet myself, you know, the amount of threats and hate mail and text messages I get from people that, you know, claim that I, you know, work for the enemy because I reported about things that happen in Gaza, about situation of civilians there. Of course, there are those phenomena. There are those phenomena everywhere. I'm sure that the same phenomena in Gaza. But on the other hand, there are also people, I think, that do understand that this conflict has to end.
You mentioned hatred. Unlike in a lot of previous conflicts, this is one has seen a lot of violence on Israeli streets too, mob violence. The New York Times reporting today that, quote, Jewish extremists are mobilizing on WhatsApp to mount what they call revenge attacks on their Palestinian fellow citizens in Israel. These are pictures on screen of a Palestinian citizen of Israel's car after he was attacked by a mob of Israeli Jews. How concerned are you about what's happening inside of Israel right now?
In my personal opinion, this is a much bigger threat than what's going on in Gaza. You know, we have a conflict with Hamas. It's not going to go away, unfortunately. But what we've seen in the last 2 weeks inside Israel is the worst intercommunal violence in the country since October 2000, the beginning of the Second Intifada. And back then, 13 Arab citizens of Israel were shot dead by police. And it created a huge rift between Jews and Arabs in this country. And we worked very hard to try and patch things up. And we had some success. And just after the last election, imagine, it wasn't so long ago, a month ago, an Arab party, was that close from being part of the government, which could have been historic. And then this violence broke up. And look, we've seen lynchings by Arabs who are attacking Jews burning cemeteries of Arabs, lynching Arabs burning synagogues. It's horrible. But I got to tell you something, that at the same time, I was surprised by the number of people, Jews and Arabs, who actually said, you know what? We're against this violence, and we are for, living together in peace.
Yes. You're right to point out that there have been, attacks on both sides. But as you yourself have reported for Axios, the vast majority of arrests for the mob violence have been Palestinian citizens of Israel, not Jewish citizens of Israel. It's been very one-sided, the law enforcement response. And of course, you have a prime minister in Benjamin Netanyahu who has emboldened some of these far-right parties, done deals with them in the Knesset. You have a prime minister who could be facing his 5th election in 2 years, who's been unable to secure his position, even with far-right support, faces multiple criminal charges. I wonder, Barak, how much of this current conflict do you think is driven by Israeli domestic politics, by Netanyahu's own personal issues and considerations?
Well, I personally do not think that this is, a House of Cards episode where everything is part of a big conspiracy. But at the same time, as you mentioned, a lot of what we see now, especially the violence on the streets of Israel, this is the height of a process that was man-made. And the man who made it is Benjamin Netanyahu. Since 2015, Benjamin Netanyahu is inciting against the Arab citizens of Israel, okay? And it is just getting worse. And as you said, in the last elections, he basically, in his own hands, brought the Kahanists, the Israeli Ku Klux Klan, into the Knesset. Okay, it is his doing. He can't say it's somebody else, I didn't know. He did it. Okay, and this is why in big part, he is responsible for this intercommunal violence that we've seen lately.
We're out of time, Barak, but I have to ask, yes or no, will Benjamin Netanyahu you can't speak for Hamas. I'm not asking you to analyze the inside heads of the Hamas leadership, but Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, will they agree to a ceasefire in the coming days, yes or no?
I think so. I think we're somewhere between 24 to 48 hours away of a ceasefire.
I hope you're right. Barak Ravid, thank you so much for appearing on the show tonight. Please do stay safe.